Okay, good morning. Actually, yeah, we're still morning, just. So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to MS-900. So, before I get started, just a few things about me. My name's Mark O'Shea, as you can read. I've been doing Microsoft certification since 1993, which means I haven't been 21 for quite a few years. So I'm sort of closing in on 100 Microsoft exams passed. I'm not in a great rush to get there. It'll happen as it happens. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today will be not necessarily just related to this exam, but just other exam strategies that will really help you to prepare for exams. And one of the reasons why I want to spend a bit of time going through this, and I'll get a show of hands, how many of you are doing this as your first Microsoft exam? Okay, so that's the kind of, response that I was expecting, that the majority of you would be in that situation. And some of the things that probably cause the most concern before you do the first exam, it's not necessarily concerns about your skill level, it's the whole exam process, what's involved. So I'll try to make it, give you as much guidance as I possibly can to help walk you through that process. And because I've had to run probably 30 to 40 training sessions for the MS-900 exam, I'm getting, if I say so myself, I'm getting pretty good at predicting what people need to learn in order to get through the exam. So even after the session, if you want to have a quick chat to me, I can, give me 30 seconds of your background and I'll tell you what to focus on. It's getting a bit easier. So let's just sort of jump into some of the key takeaways first of all. So this is an exam prep session. We'll talk about some of the exam topics. Now, probably the most important thing with this exam that catches everyone by surprise who does it is, wow, it covered a lot of different things. And this is something that, regardless of how much experience someone does or doesn't have with M365, the real challenge here is that, do you think there are many people in the world who could honestly put their hand up and say, I am a Microsoft 365 expert? Microsoft 365 is a pretty diverse set of products and technologies. Now, most of the time we find that people come into it, maybe you've got strong Office skills, or you've got strong EMS skills, or strong Windows skills, or maybe a combination of two of those. But we find it's quite rare that someone is quite comfortable across all three. And once we start throwing in things like compliance and some of the security questions it asks, everyone will have questions that will be a little bit out of their comfort zone. Now, it's not to say that it's a tough exam. It's just that if you don't prepare properly for it, they can ask questions that you're just not prepared for. So I want to make sure that we cover some of these things off. And then at the end, we'll talk about some study material, some of the different links. The good news is that as of September, we finally had a practice exam for this one. So this was something that was like a bit of a concern for people who were in the same boat as a lot of you, who just didn't know what the testing experience was going to be like. You didn't have a practice exam to give you a good idea. So that's something that is available now. So just first off, when we take a look at some of the different certifications, we don't really need to go through too many of the things that are on here. All we really need to look at here is that Microsoft 365 Certified Fundamentals, it's an entry-level exam, but it's an entry-level technical exam. So this is one of the other things that's caught some people out. Like I know some organizations have thrown like a lot of their pure salespeople, for example, at it, or even they've thrown their marketing people at the exam. And it's been much more of a struggle for them, as you can imagine, because they were expecting it to be, should I use Teams? Yes or no? You are not going to get many questions that easy in the exam. But yeah, so with this exam, it's the entry-level exam. But the good thing is if you do get through and you pass this exam, it means you actually get the fundamental certification. So if you get that done this week here, it means you get a physical badge. So not just a virtual badge that you can put in your email signature or on your LinkedIn profile, you get a physical badge as well. Now, it doesn't count towards the other exams, but for people who are sort of looking at just getting started with the Microsoft certification, especially on the M365 path, I'd highly recommend this. So when we take a look at the audience profile, this starts to give a bit of an idea is that, it's primarily a software as a service exam, but as we start going through the objectives, it covers a little bit of PaaS, and it also covers a little bit of IaaS. And even though you might be thinking, but it's an M365 exam, why would it ask about IaaS? The answer to that and many other questions you might have during this is because it's in the exam objectives. So if it's in the exam objectives, it's something that you do need to be prepared for. Now, as I mentioned with this one, this is a nice one where there aren't that many exams where you can do just one exam and actually earn a certification through that. So this is one of those exams, so that does make it a lot easier. Now, for the basics, who wants some good news? See that 40 to 60 questions? So when I did this exam early in its life, I got close to 60 questions that had to be answered in 60 minutes. And even though a lot of the questions weren't that difficult and there was no real time concern, I don't pay a lot of, I'm willing to admit, I don't pay a lot of attention to detail. So I'll start reading something and go, I'm bored of reading the question. What are the potential answers? So I tend to treat exams as a bit of a speed run. It's like, how quickly can I get out and reward myself with a hamburger? And so this exam, what's even better now is the last few times we've done group-based testing for this, people have been getting between 29 to 35 questions. So it doesn't quite match that number. So it doesn't mean that it won't get back to that number at some point, but with that 29 to 35 questions, it means that people have got plenty of time to go through, review the questions. But my guidance here is answer every question before you proceed. Regardless of whether you know the answer or not, proceed. Just make sure you've guessed an answer. And there's two reasons for that. The first one, which is one that you probably won't hit, which is if you run out of time. Like, I doubt that that's going to happen to you. But the second one is that there are some exam questions where they'll put a set of questions together in a cluster. So I need to move over here so people over here can see me for a moment. When you put the question, they put certain questions in a cluster and they give you like a lot of information saying that once you click next on these questions, you cannot go back to this set of questions. So if someone clicks next without answering the question, you have just said farewell to potentially a 50-50 point kind of scenario. So make sure you answer everything. Now, even though it's quite clear on, before you get to that section at the top of the exam question, it will tell you that, but we still encounter it where people go, oh, I was nervous, it was an exam, and they click through and they've just thrown a few points away. Now, you do get time to go through and put comments in on questions, etc. at the end, but just a couple of the things that I want to talk about with this. And this sort of is mostly for those of you who haven't done a Microsoft exam previously. Draw a line in the sand of around 3 to 6 months ago in terms of where product features were. So anything that was announced this week, nothing to do with this exam. So the time that it takes to write the new questions or update questions, so don't think, oh, well, I'll keep delaying the exam because I want to learn what's new. Do the exam sooner rather than later, because as the complexity of the underlying components keeps increasing, the number of questions and the types of things they ask you about goes from this to this to this. And those of you who've, who may, like if you've ever done an exam early on in its life cycle and you haven't passed, and then you've gone in and done the exam again a week or two later, you'll go, oh, I got maybe 20 to 30% of the same questions. But if you go back and did that second shot, like a year later or 2 years later, you'll find that there's very little overlap because they change the questions and the exam pool does keep expanding. Now, I will be doing some demos in this session because I won't spend too long on them, but I just want to make sure that you're getting exposed to user interface elements here. So this is another thing that's thrown some of the people that I know who've done this exam is they were going, oh, I didn't realize it would expect me to be able to highlight something on the admin center, for example. Now, it doesn't expect you to be like expert level admin. That's not what it is, but just sort of knowing that, if you see something where there's a portal-based question, it's not like a live environment where you have to do things. It's a hotspot question. So I just tell people that hotspot questions are effectively a visual multiple choice question, but instead of A, B, C, or D, it's hotspot A, B, C, or D. So don't stress out too much about those. So some of the challenges. So these are some of the things that I tend to see over and over again. So the first one, that underestimating the breadth. And occasionally there are some questions in there that had me scratching my head going, I don't really know if this should be in a fundamentals exam, but maybe it's something that they're just sort of testing, just testing the waters to see, how far they can push things. But, generally, any area that you failed to look at while preparing for the exam that you don't have background knowledge of, the questions are going to be tough. But that's not to say that they're tough questions. They'll be tough questions for you if you don't know the thing that they're asking about. I also mentioned coming in with just like one of the pillars of M365. Now, I'll make a pretty safe prediction. I'm going to assume that the majority of you have probably got a stronger Office 365 background than Windows or EMS. Is that pretty accurate? Yeah, that's just the way the world is. So that's already steering you a little bit in terms of what you need to focus on in terms of the products. Now, other things that come as a bit of a surprise to people in this exam is that it does ask questions around hybrid. So it might ask some questions around Azure Active Directory Connect. So knowing some of the things there, it might ask you a little bit about Exchange Hybrid. Now, it's not asking you intimate details of how you'd configure it and how you'd get it up and running, but it's just sort of knowing some of the benefits, some of the reasons why people would do that. Now, the non-technology pieces that I see that people tend to stumble with a bit here is, so how many of you would say that you're mostly technical with very little licensing knowledge? Okay, so notice I'm choosing safe questions to ask. This is one of the things that tends to catch the technical people out a little bit more. Now, I'll focus, when we get to the licensing section, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about the licensing options that you really need in a bit more detail. But the main ones are if you've got a basic understanding of what the difference is between Microsoft 365 E3 and Microsoft 365 E5, primarily on the security and compliance side. But if we get time, I'll come back in and try to sort of give a bit more detail of what I mean by that. Understanding some of the different support options that are available. Other things that start coming into play here that also catch people out a little bit. How many of you are familiar with the CSP program for licensing M365 or O365 or Azure? Okay, so that's what I was expecting. It's not going to be a huge portion of you. They assume that from the licensing side that you've got a bit of an understanding around differences between pay-as-you-go, the CSP program, and enterprise agreements. Now, this is one of those things that what's the likelihood that in the real world that a single person has got exposure to all three of those? Like, unless you work for a partner, a Microsoft partner, it's quite a low. Just make sure that you're not going, I know licensing, and move on. Look at some of the different ways that you can license it. And then, as I mentioned, some of the compliance tools are also areas that become a little bit problematic. Now, in terms of the breakdown of the exam, the cloud concepts, I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. This is just basic PaaS versus IaaS. That's 15 to 20% of the exam. The bulk of the exam is the core Microsoft 365 services. So this is more of the product-focused capabilities. The compliance, privacy, trust piece, part of this is what you get to control. So what are the security controls that you can put in place? But then the other half of it is what does Microsoft do under the covers? So things like Service Trust Portal, Compliance Manager. So what are the things that Microsoft provides that aren't necessarily technical features, but things that can help you meet those compliance requirements? And then finally, as I mentioned, that 25 to 30% is on pricing and support. So if you're coming in purely with the technical skills, some of the stuff in that final section might be something that you've just never been exposed to. Now, for the cloud concepts, as I said, I just want to spend the least amount of time on this one. But this is IaaS versus PaaS, private cloud, public cloud, hybrid. Now, I'll give you a little clue here. When it comes to public cloud, private cloud, and hybrid, private probably shouldn't be the correct answer in an M365 exam. So if you're seeing something where you're getting a hint that they're going, it feels like there's something private, there's something keeping something on-prem, keep looking at it because it's probably a hybrid question. Now for the core technologies that are included. Now with this one, the good thing here is they do limit the scope of the products that they're going to ask you about. Now, the fact that something's not listed here, don't go, why isn't the product I love not listed here, for example? Don't worry about that. Just think of it in terms of they had to sort of pick and choose what were the main things that they needed to focus on here. So Windows 10 Enterprise is one of them, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and now it's kind of weird here because they've thrown EMS in. EMS isn't a product, it's a suite. So, but they really do expect you to know EMS. So do any of you have a bit of an EMS background? So Intune, AAD Premium, Azure Information Protection. So my take on this is that because you never use that in isolation, you're always using it to protect devices or to protect Office 365 workloads, people with an EMS background tend to get through this exam pretty easily because you're like, oh, well, I know the better together story kind of thing. So just sort of be aware with this, but it doesn't mean that you won't get questions that you might have multiple choice questions where you might see options around Yammer, Sway, Flow, et cetera, but in most cases think that they're not the things you need to know a lot about. They're probably things that are going to be distractors in the answers. Now, just quickly here, because we've got SharePoint and Teams sitting here side by side, when it comes to questions around collaboration or teamwork, they're not going to try to get you to do a head-to-head face-off between two technologies that can do that one thing. So if they're saying, so if we use the example of online document collaboration, like what tools do we have in M365 that allow online collaboration? So we've got the Office apps themselves, we've got SharePoint Online, we can now do it in Teams, we can do it in OneDrive, so they're not trying to get you to pick one. Instead, what they'll do is give you a little bit of extra information that eliminates the others or highlights the others. So if it's, allows you to do online document collaboration and includes a chat-based workspace, well, so there's always going to be that little clue that helps you to eliminate that. So if you read the question and then you go, oh, 3 or 4 of these answers look good, what it probably really means is that you need to reread the question, but now in mind of that you need to be looking for something that's going to eliminate other things. And that's a fairly common thing through a lot of Microsoft exams. So the faster that you can start filtering out incorrect answers, the easier it is to get down to a 50-50. And getting down to a 50-50 is a pretty good shot of getting through. Now, just to quickly show you a couple of different things in here, I'm going to use the demo or the admin center for two different purposes in one go. So first of all, I just want to jump into users. So this is a tenant with the Microsoft 365 business license. Now, I'm also going to make another assumption that most of you have got absolutely no exposure to Microsoft 365 business. So who does have exposure to Microsoft 365? See, knowing your audience in advance really makes it a lot easier. So for Microsoft 365 Business, think of it as it's almost a subset of Microsoft 365 E3, but it has Office 365 ATP P1 included. So it's not a true subset of Microsoft 365 E3, it's mostly a subset. But it's 300 seats or less. So as soon as they start talking about a customer of like anything under 300 seats, or they say small business, start thinking, Microsoft 365 Business is probably the thing they're looking for. Scan the answers and see if M365B is in there. Now, just to sort of give you a little bit of a difference as to why they do go through and limit what they're actually asking you about is here. So this is a Microsoft 365 Business subscription. And if we take a look in here, for Microsoft 365 Business, it includes 33 apps. Now, they can't really expect you to know all 33 of those in any detail. And you're thinking, 33, that's kind of manageable. Well, that's Microsoft 365 Business. We haven't looked at Microsoft 365 E5 yet. If we jump over to that one, then, and if I just pick another version of me from this one, that one has got 45 different inclusions. So if it's not on that list, if it's not in the exam objectives, like having a 25-word or less understanding of what it is, so going to the overview page on Docs, or even looking at the sales material for it, is probably enough for the things that aren't the Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, et cetera type products. So important to understand that there will be potentially questions that are screenshot-based around the admin center. So some of the types of things it might be is making sure that licenses are assigned properly, that users are enabled. If you've ever used the admin center, anything that they ask you about it shouldn't, so far, those questions are going to be pretty straightforward for you. Now, once we start looking at the this part where we start looking at comparing the on-prem versions to the cloud versions. Now, how many of you have basically moved straight into the world of Exchange Online and SharePoint Online without any on-prem Exchange or on-prem SharePoint exposure? Okay, so a few of you. So this is probably the wrong audience. So this audience, most of you probably have spent a few years in IT. So some of these are just going to be really pretty straightforward things around. Effectively, it turns into what would have been an Office 365 conversation 5 to 7 years ago. So you don't need to worry about managing the underlying storage. Microsoft handles it. So these ones, if you do have that background, it's going to be pretty easy. But what a lot of the questions or the types of things they're really pushing here, it almost ends up being like you want to reduce management overhead. You want to make sure that things are globally distributed, et cetera, et cetera. So effectively, it turns into benefits of moving to the cloud conversation more so than just a pure Exchange Online versus Exchange On-Prem type conversation. And similar thing there for SharePoint. Now, on the SharePoint side, I guess it's just important to note is they're not really going to be asking you or expecting you to know the way we used to approach SharePoint. So remember the days where when we spoke about SharePoint on-prem, a lot of it was really around we're using SharePoint on-prem as a development platform that we're building other things on top of. How long has it been since you've heard that message around SharePoint Online? Or have you ever heard that message? No, with SharePoint Online, everything is around lists, document libraries, some workflow. So yeah, so they're not trying to sort of get you to sort of take you too far down there. Anything around SharePoint is going to be pretty straightforward SharePoint type capabilities that everyone's had some exposure to over the years. Now, now we're starting to get into the area that does start to stretch people a little bit. So this is where we start talking about things like Office as a service, Windows as a service. We start talking about semi-annual channel release, targeted, Windows insider builds, Office insider builds. So who's already saying, stop, you're using too many terms I'm not familiar with? So I'll jump into so the best place to sort of start learning about these is, and especially if you don't have that much Windows experience, what I'd highly recommend to you is get familiar or get comfortable and build out an Autopilot demonstration, an Autopilot virtual machine. Because how many of you have seen Autopilot previously? Okay, so that's actually a lot more. How many of you have played around with it and tested it? So, okay, that's still a better response than I was expecting. So when you start working with Autopilot, first of all, you have to learn a bit about Windows. You need to learn about Intune. If you want to push Office out, you have to start understanding the Office servicing channels. So there are all of these things that going through and setting up just a handful of things in a Windows Autopilot environment really starts to give you an idea of, now this stuff starts to make sense. So it turns it from, like, I'm trying to understand the concept and it doesn't make sense. How can we make it real? Now, hopefully the VM that perfect. This is where I wanted to be at. So how many of you haven't heard of Autopilot? Okay, so you will get asked questions about Autopilot in the exam. Now, just to give you an idea of this is a virtual machine. It's a Windows 10 Pro image. And in this case, you'll see that it hasn't asked me things such as, is this a work or personal device? It's not asking me to accept EULAs. Basically, the device has been pre-registered so that the admin can pre-provide that initial setup information. So if you are familiar with Autopilot, only be concerned with that core Autopilot scenario of getting a device drop shipped straight to a user without IT intervention. So that way it's that nice hands-free or that low touch for the admin. Now, if I just go through and sign into this, so that's Autopilot. The rest of everything that happens from here is not Autopilot. Autopilot is just that easier setup process, but now this is where some of the other things around Azure Active Directory come into play here. So this is Azure AD multi-factor authentication kicking in. So I think every Azure and M365 exam I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, that's got an Azure AD component to it has asked a version of the same question around what are the different MFA methods that Azure MFA supports. So who has done a Microsoft exam and gotten a variation of that question? Yeah. Did you also get the question around what DNS record type should you choose to verify a domain name? Yeah, like that's in nearly, yeah, so Azure Active Directory skills are one of the things that makes so much more of this stuff a lot easier as you start moving forward. Now, in this case, so in order to make this work, this is all real. There's no smoke and mirrors here. The only thing I've done is not use Wi-Fi. I don't think I need to explain that one based on what you've probably been encountering in certain spots in here. Now, here we go. This is Windows Hello for Business kicking in. So, and as this goes through, this will start to highlight, we'll start seeing some automatic customization of the screen. Okay, so we're a little bit too fast getting in here. But if we leave this and we keep coming back into it, we'll start seeing that it will start getting things populated. Office will be installed. The start screen layout will get changed. Some apps will get pushed down from the store. So we'll drop back into that, and I'll show you some of the things that I've done behind the scenes to make that work. Now, when it comes to the Office Pro Plus conversations, some of this is effectively going to be click-to-run versus MSI-based installations. So how many of you have, like over the last year or so, had to start finally moving away from MSI-based installations or XE-based installations across to click-to-run? So yeah, so these are things that if you've been working in the O365 world for a while, there are a lot of things that you've probably already forgotten about the benefits of click-to-run because you're just using them. So the hint here is if you see an answer that says MSI, just look at it and go boo, hiss, and move forward. Now, I can say that now. Like just over a year ago, we couldn't say that because there was still a current version of Office in market that did have MSI. So we couldn't be, or click-to-run type, sorry, not non-click-to-run. So we couldn't be too mean about it. But it hasn't been the current perpetual version of Office for a year now. So click-to-run, you don't need to understand how to go through and create a config XML file. But understanding things such as the Office deployment rings, and I'll show you some of this in a moment, and this also ties into some of the other bits with Windows. So let's just have a quick look at some of these. Let's see if there's any changes here yet. So even though I'm wired, this looks like I'm not getting very much throughput because I should be seeing a lot of different things by now. Okay, so let's go back to, okay, this is the right one. Okay, so for learning about Intune, the easiest way to think about this is if you go to devicemanagement.microsoft.com. So when it comes to, you might even get questions around which of the following URLs should you go to perform certain tasks. So remember that a lot of them have moved over to .microsoft.com. So admin.microsoft.com. How many of you still go to portal.office.com? Okay. Wean yourself away from that. It makes your life easier. How many of you go to portal.office.com and also go to portal.azure.com? How often do you start typing in POR, hit enter, and it takes you to the wrong one? That's my productivity hint for the day. Go to admin.microsoft.com, and you'll never make that mistake again. So in this case, if we take a look here, this is inside of Intune. I've got Windows 10 update rings. So some of the terms that you will see in the exam, and there's one in particular that I do want to talk about in here, is here if we see we've got semi-annual channel and semi-annual channel targeted. Now, with the 1903 release of Windows 10, semi-annual channel targeted stopped being a thing. But for the exam, it could still be a thing because not everyone is running within a version or two. And if we think about it, 1903 is, or as of up until just now, 1903 was the current version. So if you see questions around semi-annual channel targeted, that's just where Microsoft releases it, and effectively it gets pushed out the same way that it would get pushed to a consumer. But one of the things that's not listed in this list is the long-term servicing branch or the long-term servicing channel. Now, if in general day-to-day conversations, if someone says, I want to talk to you about long-term servicing channel or long-term servicing branch, I'll say, are you sure? I think you might be mistaken. And those of you who work with the long-term servicing channel or have had to steer people away from that. So that's a version that's a subset of a version of Windows 10 that's frozen at a point in time, that things like the Surface team don't support it, the Office team don't support it with Proplus any longer. So if that's not enough of an incentive for you to not use it, now but if it's something where it's like a fixed or a limited function device, something that, where there's like maybe there's an older line of business app that's incredibly sensitive to changes, it might be okay for that. But think of it in terms of more of a, the best way to think about it is if you see a scenario that's a little bit closer to a Windows embedded or an embedded OS type scenario, then long-term servicing is going to be a good option for that. Now, just a few other things in here. If we go out to apps, I'll show you that we've got some similar things here when it comes to deploying Office. So if I just jump in and we say we want to deploy Office, we'll come down and we'll choose Office 365 Suite, Windows 10, and probably the main things around this is that for the update channel, you'll see here that we get 2 monthly options and we get 2 semi-annual options. Now, for most organizations, they tend to go down the semi-annual channel path. That means that there's several months of fixes rolled into the targeted release. So if you're not familiar with these terms, read the appropriate articles up on Docs that will go through and explain what they mean. But with the monthly ones, this is where you're effectively committing to getting updates pushed out on basically a monthly basis, but not security updates. It's like all of them will get monthly security updates. But this is where you're getting feature updates on a monthly basis. And just to give an idea of timeframes, with monthly targeted, you get that release about a week before monthly. And with semi-annual targeted, it's around 5 months before that becomes semi-annual. So effectively here with monthly, people are getting new features potentially rolled out in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc. on a monthly basis. And most of the time you don't even know that they're there, except you'll restart Office at some point and there'll be a little pop-up that says, here's new stuff we've added. And if you're anything like me, you've hit close before you've read what it was, and you're like, oh, I hope I remember what, I can go back and find what that was. So I'm showing this to you in the device management console so that you know that there is this central place that you can go through. But alternatively with Office, some of the other things that, so another website that's going to be useful to know is config.office.com, which kind of breaks with the .microsoft.com that other things are using. So yeah, it doesn't quite get there. But also make sure that you have had some exposure, even just reading the information on the download page for the Office deployment tool or the ODT. So even though you're probably not using that as much as you may have earlier, because now config.office.com really does do a good job of allowing you to create the custom XML files. And then the final thing that I just want to show you in here is that, just to sort of show that it's important to understand how Intune works for this exam, is because things like if we go down to device enrollment, this is also where we're going through and working with Autopilot. So let's just see if we've got, okay, we've got some things happening here. You can see that Edge Dev has been installed. Office has been installed, but for some reason the desktop background hasn't come through. So that actually did work pretty quickly. But even there, the fact that it didn't put that default background on, it shows that there's a customization that's come through. Even, I'm sure if I can, I'll see, actually, let's try it with Edge Dev. Because this is a demo that unfortunately I used to have to do in Internet Explorer. And I'd rather not do it in that. So what I'm hopefully able to show you here, and I'm not sure if it's going to work. So there it said, if you sort of saw that, it says we're signing you into Internet Explorer, into Edge. So what it's doing there is signing in using my Azure AD credentials and going out to the enterprise state roaming capabilities of Azure Active Directory. But we'll talk about some of the Azure AD bits pretty shortly. I'm just keeping an eye on time to make sure we get through it. But devicemanagement.microsoft.com, for those of you who do primarily work with Office, I'd say for your learning, that's one of the places you should spend a lot of time just poking around, clicking out, seeing what links are in there. Now, I mentioned earlier that when it comes to things like the collaboration and mobility, or the collaboration side is generally pretty easy. They're not trying to pit one against the other without giving you something that really breaks it down and says, the chat-based workspace is a perfect example of that. But they might have other things. So if we go back to that example of which one of the following would you potentially use for that document collaboration, it might list 10 different things, and each one of them is a true false. So that way, again, they're not trying to get them into like a king of the hill type scenario or last person standing. They're just sort of testing that you know what the underlying capabilities are. So that's where you're more likely to see something like a OneDrive or a Yammer mentioned, as opposed to it being one of the feature products. Now, Intune does pop up in several ways in this exam. Now, sometimes they'll say Intune. In other places, they'll say mobile device management or mobile application management or cloud-based device management. As soon as you see something that's something management, it's probably something related to Intune. Now, one of the exam objectives is incredibly vague. Describe analytics capabilities in Microsoft 365. That's like a list like that. But or at least right now, what it seems to be is understanding workplace analytics versus workplace analytics versus My Analytics. Now, how many of you get the weekly My Analytics emails telling you how bad a job you're doing of looking after work-life balance? It's like, you have, so I had a fantastic example a few weeks ago where it's like, you had excellent focus time during the week, but you were you didn't have for a month, you didn't have any non-work days. And it's like, well, yeah, that's called life. So make sure that you're understanding the differences. The other thing that's important here is that with workplace analytics, remember that that's not included with any of the SKUs. That's an add-on to other products. So My Analytics, pretty much these days, it seems like anyone with this probably isn't quite accurate, but it feels like if you've got an Exchange Online mailbox as part of your plan, you get something My Analytics based on that. So here's just a screenshot that I've got of going into insights from Outlook, for example. So just do a little bit of reading on those, or if you do get that weekly email, don't just delete it. Read it to get an idea of what it's doing. Even if you're not planning on making any work changes, at least it's going to help you with the exam. Now, moving into the security compliance components, then this is where it starts being really more of an identity protection and application protection and data protection type of conversation. So sometimes it might be something as easy as which of the following pillars does something fall into? So is this something that would be enabled for identity protection or information protection? So as soon as it's Azure AD, it's going to be something identity protection based. Now, they'll also expect you to have a bit of an understanding of the different synchronization options or authentication options you've got when you're using Azure Active Directory Connect. So if terms such as pass-through authentication, password, hash sync, and Active Directory Federation services aren't really things that you've had to do much with, just go through, take a look at the documentation. There are some great docs articles that basically walk you through flowcharts and decision trees of here's where you'd use one versus the other. Now, the AIP side of it is just so that we've got Azure Information Protection. We can install the AIP client so that will integrate with Office, do labeling, et cetera, for us. So so for these ones, it doesn't expect to know a lot. For MFA, just remember the authentication methods that are supported. So they are SMS, they are phone call, they're notification through mobile app, and it's a 6-digit code through a mobile app or a hardware device. Azure MFA does not support Windows Hello. It does not support Face ID or Touch ID. It doesn't support the fingerprint reader on anything, because they're things that are happening at the device level that might be talking to something like the Microsoft Authenticator app. So what you'll find is they'll throw in things that you go, that's what I use on my phone, but it's not the thing that Azure MFA itself supports. And you can sort of get an idea of where that one causes confusion. Now, the other thing that causes a bit of confusion with MFA is they'll potentially throw in things that might be part of the self-service password reset process. So self-service password reset has got security questions. It's got calling a secondary, emailing a secondary email address. So self-service password reset supports those, but MFA doesn't support those. So again, that's something where people are going, oh, I'm sure when I set up for MFA that I got asked security questions as well. And it's like, no, now because we've got that integrated enrollment experience, it really blurs the lines from the user perspective as to what's actually going on. Now I'm keeping my light up here has turned yellow, which means we've got to make sure we get through this. Now, one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet that I need to mention here, because this drove me a little bit crazy in this exam and other exams, they might say something like Azure AD Premium without saying P1 or P2. And that gets me really twitchy. It's like, give me the information I need. But what you'll find is that as soon as you see something that's that generic, it means that it's more than likely it's something that's in Azure AD Premium P1 that obviously is then also going to be in Azure AD Premium P2. So don't get too caught up on that, and you'll see similar things where it might be you're the administrator of Contoso who has X number of Microsoft 365 licenses. And for me, that drives me crazy because it's like, well, I want to know, is it E3, is it E5, is it business? And, but it doesn't matter for those questions. Just read the question or read the scenario, look at the question, look at the answers, and that does address that. Now, just with the Azure AD piece, what I'd suggest to you here in terms of just the easiest way to go through that is like to sort of get a maximum hit through a single set of technologies is if you go through and learn a bit about conditional access policies, this will go through and expose you to a whole bunch of Azure AD capability that, first of all, it's going to be incredibly useful in your job moving forward if you're not using it already. But it's also something that will start bringing some of the concepts around using identity-based security, securing SaaS apps, et cetera, and again, so things like Azure AD skills just help a lot with other parts of this exam and other exams. Now, just a few more slides in here. And so for Intune, mobile device management, you're managing the entire device. Mobile application management, you're only managing the user profile within the application. So that way, if someone says, I've lost the device, and it's my personal device, but I don't want you to erase everything, mobile application management just means we can erase the corporate data without touching anything else that is user data related. Now, for the Service Trust Portal and Compliance Manager pieces, then the best thing I can recommend here is, actually, I don't have this open, but it won't take long to get to it. Spend a little bit of time jumping around in Compliance Manager. Oops, that's one that, okay, we're sort of getting short on time. I'll talk about it instead. When you get into Compliance Manager, don't get tricked by the naming scheme they're using. They've got Compliance Manager and Compliance Manager Classic. Which one do you think you need to know? Classic, yes. Yeah, good, bad answer, bad, good answer, or good, bad answer. And the reason is as soon as you click on the one that's not Classic, it's got Preview in there. So spend a little bit of time in there, get an understanding of what it is. So, where would you use the Service Trust Portal? Where would you use Compliance Manager? What are Microsoft's statements around this? So because we're short on time, I won't worry about demonstrating this. But for the licensing piece, the license types to really focus on Microsoft 365 Business, Microsoft 365 E3, and Microsoft 365 E5. Now, they don't expect you to know like huge amounts of details around them, but just know that that's mostly the stacking order: B up to E3 up to E5. Now, let's just sort of jump through to actually for support. Now, this is where the CSP. Those of you who aren't familiar with CSP models, when a partner who is acting on behalf of Microsoft and working as a CSP, they are responsible for supporting that tenant. So the customer has to go through the partner rather than through Microsoft. Whereas if you're going through pay-as-you-go or if you're going through enterprise agreements, it's Microsoft who's completely covering you for that. So then finally, with general availability, that's where things like the SLA will kick in. That's where pricing, et cetera, is happening. And now I've got a flashing red light. So let's just go through some of the final bits. So how many of you are going to be doing the exam over the next couple of days? And have you booked already? Book quickly. Yeah, because the slots are filling up fast. Make sure you jump over to the hands-on lab area as well if you want to sort of go through the practice lab. But look, even if you're not confident about it, it's a free exam. Go in, get it done, and worst case scenario, you had a free practice exam. Best case scenario, you get an exam and a certification. So it's a no loss deal there. So yeah, so there is a practice exam, but there is the Azure Fundamentals material up on Microsoft Learn as well, so you can go through that. But for a lot of this, like when you're digging deeper, there's no getting around it. docs.microsoft.com is just the best place to go for Microsoft content. But just don't get too caught up on things that are new or improved. Remember, when you're preparing for the exam, you're not preparing for the thing you need to know now for your job. You're preparing for the thing you need to do now for the exam. So with that, I'll finish up here, and because otherwise we'll start getting upset people coming in for the next session. But I'll just sort of move over to the side so the next speaker can come and start getting set up. So if anyone's got any questions, I'll hang around for a while and more than happy to answer them. So thank you, everyone, for heading along.